Before a Senate hearing Monday, accused of perpetrating massive fraud against the Social Security Administration. 4 witnesses testified against Khan and Judge David B. Doherty, alleging they collaborated on more than...
Let's go to Minnesota now, where the FBI ramps up its fraud investigation targeting the state's Somali community. So in a post to social media last night, FBI Director Kash Patel announced a surge in federal agents and investigators.
On paper, every payment looked legal, every name had a file, every file had a number, every number led to a person who supposedly existed. But when federal agents knocked on the first door, they found an empty lot. At the second address, they found a burned-out trailer. At the third, they found a woman who had been dead for 9 years. And that was the moment investigators realized this wasn't just fraud, it was a machine hidden inside one of the most trusted benefit systems in America. By sunrise, FBI tactical teams, DEA agents, DOJ investigators, and federal auditors were moving toward a government-linked headquarters in Baltimore, Maryland. The target was not a cartel warehouse. It wasn't a nightclub, a port, or a stash house. It was the headquarters of an SSA Director. And behind those glass doors, agents believed they were about to uncover more than 1,000 fake records, a missing $2.2 billion, and a federal corruption network that had been quietly feeding itself for years. But the strangest part was this: the money was not disappearing randomly, it was being routed with purpose. Someone inside knew exactly where it was going. The case began with a pattern nobody wanted to believe. A junior analyst named Mara Ellis was reviewing flagged benefit payments from Maryland, Virginia, Florida, Texas, and Arizona. At first, nothing looked dramatic. No single payment was large enough to trigger panic. No single file looked explosive. That was the beauty of it. The theft was quiet, a few $1,000s here, a disability claim there, survivor benefits sent to one account, emergency assistance sent to another. But when Mara grouped the payments together, one detail kept repeating. The same medical codes, the same approval language, the same internal override stamp, 5 states, hundreds of names, one approval signature, Director Nathaniel Cross. Cross was not a public celebrity. He did not appear on cable news. He was the kind of powerful man who stayed invisible. Quiet suits, closed-door meetings, carefully worded memos, a reputation for being strict, efficient, and impossible to question. Inside the office, people called him the Wall. Because once Cross signed off on something, nobody pushed back. But Mara did. She sent the first report to her supervisor. Nothing happened. She sent a second report with 43 suspicious records. Again, nothing happened. Then she found the file that changed everything. A man named Leonard Pike had received federal benefits for 8 years. His file showed medical evaluations, address updates, identity confirmations, and routine payment approvals. But Leonard Pike had died in 2016. His funeral notice was still online. His benefit file had been updated 6 times after his death, and every update came from inside the same regional system controlled by Cross. That night, Mara printed the records and walked them to a federal fraud task force office herself. 48 hours later, the FBI opened a sealed inquiry. Within 3 weeks, the DEA was involved. At first, that made no sense. Why would the DEA be inside a Social Security fraud case? Then agents followed the money. The first layer was government theft. The second layer was identity manipulation. The third layer was medical fraud. But the fourth layer went somewhere much darker. Some of the benefit payments were being moved into, shell clinics tied to pain management networks in Florida and Nevada. Those clinics had already appeared in DEA files connected to illegal prescription distribution, cash laundering, and controlled substance diversion. In simple terms, stolen federal money was being used to keep criminal medical networks alive. And the fake SSA records were not just names, they were financial fuel. The first cinematic break in the case came during a raid in Tampa. Agents entered a closed rehabilitation clinic that had no patients, no doctors on site, and no working phones. Inside, the lobby still had chairs lined against the wall. A faded poster warned about opioid abuse. The reception desk was covered in dust, but behind a locked supply room, investigators found a hidden office. Inside were file boxes, hundreds of them. Each folder had a name, a benefit number, a clinic code, and a handwritten mark in red ink. Some folders were tagged active, some were tagged sleeping, and 37 were tagged with one word, Protected. That word changed the entire direction of the investigation because it meant someone was not only creating fake records, someone was deciding which records could never be touched. Back in Baltimore, Cross continued his normal routine. He arrived early, he avoided long conversations, he held meetings without phones in the room, he spoke about efficiency, fraud prevention, and public trust. To everyone watching from the outside, he looked like the man responsible for protecting the system. But behind him, the numbers were bleeding. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit began mapping the flow. Payments moved from federal benefit accounts into prepaid instruments, nonprofit vendors, clinic reimbursements, legal trusts, and consulting contracts. Then the money split again into property purchases, luxury vehicles, cryptocurrency wallets, and accounts tied to people who had no visible income. The total grew from $18 million to $140 million, then $600 million, then $1.3 billion. By the time the DOJ entered the Central Evidence Review, the estimated exposure had crossed $2.2 billion. But the number that disturbed investigators most was not the money. It was the records. 1,000 fake identities, not stolen from one breach, built slowly, layer by layer. Some were dead people, some were homeless people. Some were real citizens whose personal information had been duplicated and altered. Some appeared to be completely manufactured from fragments of other lives. The system had created ghosts, and those ghosts were getting paid. One human story pulled the case into sharper focus. In Phoenix, Arizona, a retired teacher named Ruth Delgado had been fighting for months to correct her benefits. Her payments were delayed, then reduced, then frozen without explanation. Every time she called, she was told her record showed conflicting activity. Ruth was 72. She lived alone. She had taught elementary school for 31 years. What she didn't know was that inside the system, a second version of her existed. Same birth month, similar social security sequence, different address, different bank route. That duplicate identity had been receiving payments under an emergency disability classification Ruth never applied for. While Ruth waited on hold, someone else was cashing checks under the shadow of her life. And that was only one case. In Atlanta, a veteran named Calvin Brooks discovered his survivor benefits had been tied to a dependent he never had. In Detroit, a woman received a notice saying she had moved to Nevada. She had not left Michigan in 12 years. The victims were not just taxpayers, they were real people trapped inside a corrupted mirror of themselves. But investigators still had one problem. They could prove the system was dirty. They could not yet prove who controlled it. Cross's signature appeared everywhere. But federal prosecutors needed more than a signature. They needed intent. They needed communications. They needed internal coordination. They needed the person behind the wall. Then came the mid-twist. An FBI analyst noticed that several fake records were not approved by Cross directly. They were approved using his credentials. At first, that looked like a defense. Maybe Cross would claim someone stole his access. Maybe he was being framed. Maybe the entire case was about lower-level employees exploiting the director's authority. For several tense days, the investigation almost shifted away from him. Then the cyber team recovered access logs from a secure administrative terminal. The logins happened late at night, after building access had closed, from inside the executive floor using a workstation assigned to Cross's private suite. But there was something even more important. The same nights those files were approved, Cross's official vehicle entered the underground garage. The badge logs matched. The elevator logs matched. The camera footage matched. The wall was cracking. Still, Cross was not alone. He had help inside finance, compliance, medical verification, and external vendor management. The operation worked because every layer had a person whose job was to make the fraud look boring. That was the secret. Nothing screamed crime. Everything looked administrative. A corrected address, a reactivated claim, a missing form override, a medical review exception, a deceased beneficiary status reversal, tiny changes that meant nothing alone. But together, they built a pipeline. The second major visual discovery happened in a storage facility outside Richmond, Virginia. Agents opened Unit 214 after tracing monthly payments from a consulting company tied to Cross's assistant. Inside, they found metal cabinets, burner phones, old laptops, and sealed envelopes stacked in plastic bins. At the back of the unit was a whiteboard. On it were 5 columns: names, states, status, payment route, risk. and under the final column, someone had written 3 warnings: do not touch Florida batch, DEA exposure possible, director approval only. That was the first time the drug connection appeared in writing. DEA investigators moved fast. They connected several shell clinics, receiving money from fake benefit records to prescription drug distribution networks. These were not street corner operations. They were polished billing offices, legal paperwork, professional websites, clean waiting rooms. But behind the front, the clinics were moving cash, prescriptions, and influence. The stolen SSA money helped them pay recruiters, corrupt medical staff, transport handlers, and legal buffers. A federal benefit system had become a backdoor bank, and every time someone asked why the numbers looked strange, the answer came from above. Director Cross had already approved it. The raid plan came after a closed DOJ meeting in Washington, D.C. Prosecutors feared evidence would vanish if the suspects sensed pressure. The FBI believed Cross had begun moving records. DEA agents had intercepted communications suggesting one clinic operator in Miami was preparing to leave the country, so the operation expanded. Baltimore, Tampa, Miami, Richmond, Phoenix, Las Vegas, 6 cities, multiple warrants, one synchronized morning. The Baltimore team moved on Cross's headquarters just before employees began arriving. Black SUVs lined the curb. Agents entered through the front and rear access points. Inside the lobby, security officers were ordered away from the elevators. Federal auditors went straight to the records division. Cross was found inside his private office. Not running, not shouting, standing behind his desk in a pressed charcoal suit, looking at a locked cabinet. One agent told him to step away. Cross said only one sentence: "You don't understand what you're opening." That line stayed with investigators because when they opened the cabinet, they didn't find cash. They found a black binder. Inside were lists of names, payment batches, internal employee initials, clinic contacts, and coded references to political donors, real estate companies, and offshore consultants. The binder was not just evidence, it was a map. The third visual moment happened minutes later, when agents discovered a concealed server rack behind a false wall in a conference room storage area. At first, it looked like a utility panel. Then a technician noticed the screws were newer than the frame. Behind it were backup drives, encrypted storage devices, and a private network bridge that had no reason to exist inside a government administrative office. The fraud was not only hidden in paperwork, it had its own nervous system. As agents carried out evidence boxes, employees stood frozen in hallways. Some cried, some whispered, some looked furious, others looked like they had been waiting for this day for years. One compliance officer told investigators she had flagged irregular records twice. Both times, she was reassigned. Another employee said Cross's inner circle called certain files executive sensitive. Nobody knew what that meant. Now they did. By noon, the first arrests were underway. A deputy finance manager in Baltimore, a medical verification contractor in Miami, 2 clinic operators in Tampa, a records supervisor in Richmond, a payment routing consultant in Las Vegas, and finally, Nathaniel Cross. The man known as The Wall was escorted through the side entrance as cameras gathered across the street. He did not cover his face. He did not speak, but the image was impossible to ignore. A senior government official walking past federal agents while evidence boxes came out behind him. That was the public moment. But the private realization was even bigger. In this case, had never been about one corrupt director stealing money. And it was about how a trusted system can be manipulated when enough people stop asking basic questions. Who approved this? Who benefits? Who gets silenced? And why does the same name keep appearing at the top? The final reveal came from the black binder. Cross was not merely protecting fake records, he was ranking them. Some identities were low-level payment shells, some were tied to clinics, some were tied to property transfers, but the highest value records were marked with a symbol investigators had seen before in the Tampa clinic folders, a red circle. Those were the protected files. They generated the largest payouts, moved through the cleanest routes, and were connected to the most insulated outside entities. One protected batch alone had moved more than $340 million over 6 years. and buried in that batch was the name of a consulting group that had been paid by 3 separate clinics under DEA review. That was the bridge, SSA fraud, medical laundering, drug network financing, all connected through records that should never have existed. The human impact widened quickly. Thousands of legitimate cases had been delayed because fraud checks were misdirected. Elderly recipients waited longer. Disabled applicants were pushed into review queues. Families dealing with death benefits were told their paperwork was incomplete, while fake accounts moved smoothly through the system. The machine did not just steal money, it stole time, it stole trust, it stole attention from people who needed the system to work, and that may be the most disturbing part. The fraud survived because it looked ordinary, no dramatic vault. No secret island, no cartel boss in a gold mansion, just offices, passwords, memos, signatures, forms, a crime built from routine. By the end of the first week, DOJ officials described the case as one of the most complex federal benefit fraud investigations in modern memory. More arrests were expected. More records were being reviewed. More clinics were under scrutiny. But Cross remained the center, not because he touched every dollar, because he understood the system well enough to know where nobody looked. That is what made him dangerous. Not violence, access, not chaos, control. He knew which files were ignored, which departments were overwhelmed, which warnings could be buried in bureaucracy, which employees could be intimidated with transfers, silence, or, career damage. And for years, it worked. Until one analyst noticed a dead man getting paid, until one retired teacher lost benefits to a duplicate shadow, until one storage unit revealed the warning nobody was supposed to see. DEA exposure possible. The story ends with Cross in custody, evidence still being decoded, and more than 1,000 fake records under federal review. But the bigger question does not end there, because if $2.2 billion can move through a trusted system using forms, approvals, and fake identities, how many other machines are running right now? How many crimes are hidden behind normal paperwork? And how many people are told it's just a clerical error when it's actually the first clue? If this case proves anything, it's this. The scariest criminal networks don't always hide in abandoned warehouses. Sometimes they sit under fluorescent lights, behind locked office doors, wearing government badges, signing documents that no one dares to question. And if a system like this can exist inside institutions people trust, what does that say about everything we still don't see? Comment your answer below. Was Nathaniel Cross the mastermind, or just the highest-ranking name they caught first? And if you want the next breakdown, subscribe now, because the next file may be even darker.